This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and welcome to another episode of the Unsolicited Response Show. My guest this episode hardly needs an introduction, so I'll give him a long one. It's Patrick Miller. For those of you that don't know, Patrick has done just about everything. He worked with an asset owner, PacificCorp. He was a regulator with WECC, regulating and auditing NERC CIP way at the beginning days, a community organizer, both EnergySec and BeerISAC, and very much an entrepreneur, having started multiple consulting companies in this field. And until I guess maybe a month or so ago, I would have said you are the CEO of Ampyr Industrial Security, but I saw that you changed the name of the company. You are now CEO and founder of Ampyx Cyber.
Yes.
So first, welcome to the show. And maybe I'll start with the question, why the name change?
Thank you for having me on the show, and thank you for the kind introduction. The name change, I've started a European branch as well, because there's a fair bit of stuff going on in Europe, and I seem to get tagged with everything regulatory in the world. So there's some CRA and NIS2 things that are happening in Europe. I've got some clients over there as well, so I wanted to start a European branch of the company, of the consulting firm. And the name Ampyr was, the Europeans are a little more strict on their namings, so you can't even operate even in the technology space at all. So I ended up running into a conflict with the name there. So I basically had to come up with a new brand for the global organization for both the US and the European operations. And we have some business in South America as well, but there wasn't any issue there. But it was basically to get a unified global brand.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't an issue like, the famous Nova example in Mexico, the Chevy Nova. No, it wasn't like that. It was just you were stepping on someone else's name, and you would have been a bunch of hassle to try to keep it, I guess.
Yeah. Or it's just basically when you're registering with your name in Europe as a new business, it just won't even let you register if the name already exists under some other brand that's got anything in the tech space at all. So even if you're not doing if you're service oriented versus product oriented, if it's tech at all, it just won't even let you get the name. So I didn't even have the option to use the name there.
Well, and you alluded to the second thing I wanted to ask you. In this announcement, you announced that you're opening a branch in Talinn, Estonia.
Yeah.
And I'm familiar with Talinn mainly from the Talinn manual on cyber or international law related to cybersecurity, but it's kind of an odd place. It's kind of, maybe if you were servicing Russia and some other countries, Belarus and that, it makes sense, but you're kind of on the edge there. Why'd you pick Talinn?
Yeah. And it's quite the opposite, believe it or not. They're not very friendly with Russia and Belarus.
No, I know that.
Reasons. Yeah.
But the proximity wise, I mean, geographically.
Yeah, in terms of geographics. The primary reason was I'd done some research, probably 6-8 months worth of research in terms of where to start a European business. And there's 6 countries that kind of rise to the top. Out of all of them, in terms of ease to run a company without living in the country that you're starting it in, Estonia was by far the easiest one to work with. They have a digital residency platform where you go through some basic background screening and some biometrics that you give, and you get a digital residency card, and you use that to operate your entire business remotely. So as far as kind of ease of operations, efficiency, and cost in a lot of ways in terms of the tax base and all those other things, it's extremely easy to do it. So as an e-resident, I can just pretty much operate as though I'm in the country to do anything I need.
So that makes sense. So it wasn't so much that's closest to where your customers are or something of that nature. Okay, it makes sense.
Well,
and certainly
they
a big
are
factor
in the EU.
Because,
since they're in the EU, I can take euros. So it's not as though I have to deal with a different currency. I can deal with anybody in the entire European Union and just get the VAT tax in standard currency across banks. So just from an ease of business operations, it was orders of magnitude better than any other option.
Oh, now you have my curiosity piqued. Was it difficult? Did you essentially hire someone over there to do it all for you, or were you able to navigate it yourself?
No, it was very easy. The longest process is going through the getting the e-residency. So once you've got the e-residency and you get your card and you go to a site where they basically interview you and you give you some biometrics to track who you are. Basically, most of this is to combat money theft and fraud and those kinds of things. So that's the primary reason for that. Once that was done, it was probably less than 20 minutes to have the company up and running. It
Oh,
was
okay.
really easy. Yeah.
Well, I looked at an interview that you did about 2 years ago in April 2022 with CISA, and you were describing Ampere then, and you said it's a small boutique firm. That's what I want to keep it with. I want to keep it that way as much as I possibly can. Boy, I can't read here. But you were saying that it was a small boutique firm. You want to keep it a small boutique firm. Now you're a global firm. Has your goals changed, or was that just a moment in time where you were tired of dealing with a lot of things?
Maybe a little of both. Um, I still want to keep it a boutique firm, and I've run big firms, and I've run
Yep.
some successful firms. Um, the more, the bigger the company is, the more the company is making, the more complex things get in so many ways. At this stage, I've run enough companies and sold enough companies and been part of enough startups that I don't really want to do that again. But I do want to keep this to a manageable size. I mean, for me, it's more of a lifestyle company, and
Mhm.
I want to know all my people. I want to know their spouses. I want to know their kids' birthdays. I don't want it to get so big that that dynamic is gone. So I'll do
Mhm.
whatever it takes to keep it at that level, which is typically between the 20 and 30 person state. So
Mhm.
once we hit that size, I'm just going to find ways to manage that and keep it at that space.
Mhm. Okay. Well, and that was what you said 2 years ago, so you're consistent then. So that
Yeah,
boutique firm in your mind is still a 20 to 30 person firm is still a boutique firm, but it's kind of
yeah,
pushing at the edges, right? Where you
it
need
is.
more management, logistics, infrastructure once you get much bigger than that. Okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah, and I lose
Now,
connection with the people at that point. So that is the
yeah.
biggest part for me. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'm going to take a little advantage of the fact that you're interested in Europe. You're opening an office in Europe.
Mhm.
Certainly, I want to talk about the Cyber Resilience Act and that. But before we dive into regulation, uh, someone who deals like myself, who deals mainly in the US, what would you say are one of the maybe one or two top differences in how Europe is addressing OT, cybersecurity, and cyber risk as compared to what US is doing outside of the regulatory approach?
Okay, outside of regulation. Um, that's a difficult one, Dale. I think a lot of the European vendors have kind of picked up some traction in terms of responding faster. And the reality is, it's not like there's a lot of US vendors for our OT systems. A lot of them are not US based companies. So
Hmm.
we don't have much to compare to here to say, oh, well, the US OT companies do it differently than the other ones.
Hmm.
So given that, I think that your larger OT vendors out of Europe, they've gone through the hard part of figuring out what it means to get vulnerability disclosures right, what it means to get patching right, how to keep the customers happy with respect to security differentiators and cost and those kinds of things as well. They're not all coming back and say, "Oh, you're the first company to ask for this. That'll be $1 million." That was a path a long time ago when you asked for security features. Now it's more common to just have it bundled in over time, and things like seat belts become just part of the vehicle, and crumple zones and all those other things just kind of get built in. So they're getting better and better at it. But it's not like there's a lot of comparison to U.S. companies because there's just not a lot of OT companies that are based in the U.S. In general, I think they're getting it better.
How about more on the asset owner side? For example, are you seeing the same sectors kind of leading the way? Is it electric? Are you seeing more manufacturing or rail emphasis over there, and any sort of
Mhm.
difference in terms of the asset owner side?
Uh, Europe is definitely rail. There's a lot of rail in Europe, and there's a lot of they've got regulations. There's 0507. There's a lot more passenger rail, so it's not just cargo rail. In the U.S., there's not nearly as much. So with the human element added in, it gets a lot more feedback loop from the humans that are participating in the process and could be impacted by the process to those that are regulating or managing the process as well. Um, in general, the companies I think have a different mindset. They are certainly capitalist companies where they are there to make money, but they have a more of a European feel on, um, I guess, maybe taking care of the people or taking care of the systems in a different way. It's just a different mindset. It's not as run to fail that I've seen that it is as it is in the US. It's a little more well managed. Things are thought for a little more in advance. And I'm even seeing some really proactive behaviors from some companies where I see more reactive behaviors from companies in the US or frankly, North America or even the Western hemisphere, or our side of it anyway. Yeah.
And I wonder if obviously you have the EU, you have a lot of these regulations that are EU regulations, but you're talking about a number of different countries here who are then responsible at turning those into laws and such. Um, how much difference are you seeing country to country over there?
Yeah, the way most of the EU stuff works, it is there's a base level that is operated at the entire union level, and it feels a lot like it does in the US. Some countries go above and beyond that. They're not allowed to go below it, but you can go above and beyond, and each country will kind of add their things as they see fit, depending upon where they want to add emphasis or just keep it at the European minimum. Where there gets to be differential, it can be challenging, like in the US, where you've got California going certain directions, or New York going different directions, or Texas and Florida going different directions. So it creates kind of interstate challenges with uniformity, but that's the same thing everywhere else. It's not like this is unique to the US or even Europe for that matter. You get the same thing in South America from these countries there. But there's a base minimum, and then you can go above and beyond that. I think the biggest difference, though, is in the enforcement mechanism. So what you have to do can basically be roughly similar with some variation, but how you get penalized for what you do can look different. So the enforcement structure will look different in one country from the other. So who audits you, who enforces the regulation will look different on a country to country basis. So that may be more of a challenge for uniformity than actually what you have to do is what happens if you don't.
Well, and then that will probably also affect the security posture might differ by
Yeah,
country because companies are reactive. If they say this is how I'm going to be audited, then they do certain things, and if it's
yeah,
something else, they do other things. So interesting.
yeah.
That is,
If your auditors
yeah,
are
I could
weak,
see how
indeed.
that could drive it.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
yeah,
Well, let's talk about a little bit now. You mentioned, and I asked two. The Cyber Resilience Act (CRA) is the one that's gotten my attention the most. As
yeah.
someone who's been involved with NERC CIP from the very beginning, is there something they're doing better in the CRA than what NERC CIP did in the early years? Do you see that they looked and they said, we're going to do it different and better and not make the same mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, we started NERC CIP more than 20 years ago. So
Yeah.
I would hope they got something better between 20
Yeah.
years ago and now. And even, it took us the virtualization standards for NERC CIP. We started talking about those about 10 years ago. And they went into a project and officially in 2016, and they got passed this week. It took 8 years from starting the project to get virtualization passed. 8 years. So what has happened in virtualization in 8 years? A lot.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, a lot. So it's really difficult, especially with the structures around how NERC CIP is built, to keep it up to pace with, innovation and hackers are always faster than laws. So I think what Europe has done is they've seen what the US did, and a lot of countries have seen what we did. A lot of people modeled some of their regulations after things like NERC CIP. Most of South America, for example, has adopted NERC CIP wholesale, other than like the CIP 2 kind of inclusion stuff. Uh, with that, I think even Taiwan as well. So I think what Europe did is they leapfrogged us. They took some of the best ideas and best approaches and found out where they are the most effectively placed and then applied it there. So, for example, we're just now getting to the point where we're holding boards accountable, roughly, not really, but roughly, we're getting closer and closer, inching there by these unique kind of backdoor mechanisms like holding a CISO personally accountable and then figuring out did they or did they not lie to their board, or was the board even asking the right questions. So there still isn't some direct path to get to that level to influence them. In Europe, for example, under the NIS2, I mean, the fines are serious. You can like remove board members. You can directly affect the way the board behaves for practices that are either deceptive or irresponsible. So I think they've learned a lot from where we're trying to go and where they're just going straight without waiting to get there. Can this be particularly onerous and restrictive? We'll see. I mean, we'll see how this ultimately pans out. We're just now looking at this new change, and we'll see how it gets implemented. It's likely going to be bumpy coming out of the gate, which is to be expected. But I
Yeah.
think they'll probably handle it well and refine it and normalize things over time. But it sends a clear message that, you know, if you're an owner of the company and you're a director of the company, you need to take cybersecurity seriously. And it's squarely centered on those important critical infrastructure areas with some very serious penalties, like 2% and 10 million euros. That's not small money.
Hmm.
That's for the NAS too. And for CRA in a similar way, for example, we've done various different ways to try to regulate supply chain. In the US, the only real supply chain regulation that's definitely regulation is NERC CIP 13. And it was really kind of an end run to regulate the vendors by using the utilities. So the utility is on the hook for how the vendor behaves, which is, you know, okay, we got to do something. Maybe something is better than nothing, but this is a really painful way to get where we really want to be and versus, where we should be, that kind of thing. So in the CRA, for example, it's got this recursive check. You check one level, they check the next level, and the levels just keep. You basically have kind of this bidirectional, bilateral checking to keep the system in check. So it has some interesting and creative ways to keep that regulation, I guess, in line and a little bit easier to manage. And you're not trying to eat the whole supply chain elephant all at once. Everybody gets a piece of it. So to shoulder that type of regulation makes it a little bit easier.
Now, is the CRA, is that aimed more at the vendors or the asset owners? Because
Vendors.
yeah, that's what I thought. So I
Mhm.
guess that is a completely different approach that we
Yeah.
don't really have a vendor. Well, the
No.
closest we have is FDA, right? FDA, if you want to get something, a medical
Yeah.
device approved, you have to get it FDA approved. It's not a
That's
very
the
high
closest.
bar, but it's at least a vendor bar. Interesting.
Yeah.
And do they envision having something like an ERO like NERC, something that sits between the law and the the audits and enforcement?
It's going to be country by country specific. How they enforce it is going to be decided on each country. So it'll look a lot more like Canada's version of NERC CIP than the US version of NERC CIP. In Canada, it's enforced province by province. And they kind of have some different paces and different enforcement methods and that kind of thing, even to a roughly common set of regulations.
And what about speed? You mentioned you gave that great example with virtualization, how long it took
Mhm.
before uh, before it went from an idea that everyone admitted was needed to realization. Is the CRA or is the EU regulations in general, are they moving faster? Do you expect results and changes to go in a matter of years as opposed to 5, 6, 7, 8 years?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think they'll move faster. I think somehow the EU is able to make decisions faster in a lot of ways. I don't really have a reason for why, but yeah, they seem to decide and move a little faster than the US. I also think that catalysts like having uh, uh, the Russia Ukraine war literally on their
Mm.
border can have a tendency to make you think about accelerating certain things in different ways. We don't have that. Yeah,
Well, and I think it's just maybe the American heritage has sort of a knee jerk reaction to when you say regulation. There's a certain
yeah,
percentage of Americans, and I must admit I'm a little bit in that camp as well. I kind of like, ooh, that's because there's just an anticipation that it's going to be done poorly and it's going to cause me pain.
yeah,
Whereas I think Europe is a little more regulation friendly, or quite a bit more regulation friendly, as a as kind of a cultural thing. Um, well, let's bounce back to NERC CIP. Uh, where are we now? I mean, have we reached kind of a steady state with rare changes where, uh, maybe to put it as an opening question, are most organizations that are covered under NERC CIP, are they doing a good job at complying with the current NERC CIP regulations? So when auditors go in, they tend to find little or nothing or only minor things. Does the bulk electric system have regulatory risk under control?
I do think in general it has normalized. We've gotten to a place where most of that risk is managed. in a reasonable way. And CIP did move the needle, and it's not a bad low bar. It's not going to keep you terrorist proof or nation state proof, but it does definitely increase the barrier and raise their cost to attack you. There are still companies that we come across that still don't get it on occasion. So there are still some out there that surprise me with their level of misunderstanding. But by and large, the needle has been moved. The baseline is set. There is a new normal. It is pretty challenging to do something to one of those companies. Like I say, they're not perfect, and they're not absolutely adversary proof. But it is much more difficult to do anything in the electric sector, which is one of the reasons I think we haven't seen a high level of penetration by adversaries into that sector. There's Volt Typhoon and all these discussions around China's all up in our grid. Is that actually into the control systems of these companies, or is it in some corporate environment? We don't have a lot of details on these things. So.
Well, I was going to ask you something about that later on. So let's just jump to that now. Okay. How do you react when you see all these heads of government security agencies standing in front of or sitting in front of Congress and saying the electric grid is at great risk and attackers are in the systems ready to take us down at a moment of their choosing? How do you react when you hear that, when you watch those things?
I don't react. It's not something I would expect that for any qualified country of this size, this is table stakes. Yes, you should try to penetrate those areas for all the reasons that they mentioned. The level of penetration and the level of capability, if they even did something small in some small utility somewhere, America would still freak out. So just that's the nature of America, right?
Yeah.
But the chance of them actually having a very significant, sizable single company or even regional impact is pretty low. And it's not just because these companies are like super cyber expert, like I say, adversary proof. It's because most utilities, especially electric utilities, they operate from an all hazards approach. They don't care what the hazard is. They're going to operate that system and keep it up and running. And I've seen several folks from a control center that failed literally run out and grab car batteries out of their vehicle, rack them up, and get a DC power operation running to fix a failed UPS in like 20 minutes. I mean, so you're talking about something that I think it's almost impossible to understand how complex the grid is, first of all, and it's not one grid, and all these other things that go into the physical construct of you can't really just take out America's power system front to back, like coast to coast. There's just a lot in there that is really, really misunderstood and really swirling around in a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And again, should just be kind of expected that a nation state like China would probably want to do something like this, at least to some level.
Yeah, as would probably America.
In fact, if we're not, I'm ashamed. Really?
Yeah. I mean, you want to have the capability, but I'm a little surprised, and maybe there's just no win in it for them. But I'm a little surprised that the utility industry doesn't push back on this more. They kind of just if you pull them aside and ask them, they might say, "Yeah, I don't think it's that bad." But they don't have I don't see EEI with a publicity effort to educate America and Congress about the reliability numbers on the grid and the almost zero cyber impact on the grid over the last 20 years. I see almost no response publicly on that. Why? Do you have any idea why that is?
They do. When you drag them in front of committee, they'll tell you about all their stats, and they're happy to advocate for all the things that the EISAC is doing and that the sector is doing, and the statistics on what are the reportable incidents and all of these things. So in the right audience or in the right forum, they will basically megaphone these stats, just not in this kind of public FUD setting or fear, uncertainty, and doubt setting. Most of the times the utilities don't say anything about anything at all. They're particularly tight-lipped. So unless you drag them in front of committee and ask them to showcase what they're doing, they're just not going to say anything. And some of it is that they're just notoriously close to the vest, keep things quiet, don't make any waves. But the other part of that is there's also, by advertising that you're super secure, you're also in some cases inviting, oh yeah, So like when Larry Ellison called Oracle unbreakable, I mean, that was one of the biggest mistakes he could have ever done.
Yeah.
So to go out and do that also seems to kind of invite things as well. There's a lot of dynamics in there, but in the right situation, they're happy to give you the statistics.
Yeah. We had, and I can't believe his name escapes me, but there's a gentleman from Southern Company who for a long time was the kind of the electric utility spokesman. And then he retired. It went to Bill Furman at Berkshire Hathaway Energy, who was nice enough to come to S4 a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Now he's moved on from there. Is there a new one? Is there like a new person who is the spokesman for or spokesperson for energy now?
Not that I've seen. Yeah, we don't have kind of a a face, the what is it, figurehead, so to speak, for the security motions going on. I haven't seen anybody step into those shoes just yet. I do expect it'll be somebody. I mean, at some point, because we
it's an unofficial
occasionally have to talk
role.
about it. It is.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
unofficial.
You just kind of
It
slide into
seems
it.
like this person gets, becomes the chair of the EISAC, gets on all these government committees like the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and all these sorts of things. But I haven't seen the next one, so I'm curious.
I have a few in mind that I would like to be that person, but we'll see if it happens to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the two that have done it to date have done a good job. I always kind of wonder why it's just one, if there might not be more strength in numbers, but it seems like for the last 10 years or so, there's just kind of been an agreement that this person, if someone needs to talk to the government, it's this person who's the front person. Let's go back to NERC CIP. One last question on that.
Sure.
Cloud. That's what I'm reading, people who write about NERC CIP, yourself and others, it's like, hey, it just doesn't work with the cloud. You can't comply, or it's very difficult to get the services you want and feel confident you're complying with NERC CIP. And there's some efforts going on, I understand now, to try to address that. Is there a solution we should accept or expect in the next 1 or 2 years, or is this another 5-year effort?
Yeah. We got some good progress recently. In January, we enacted a couple of standards, CIP 4.7 and 11, that came out. With those changes, what they've done is basically kind of written in the allowability to put at least the data in the cloud. So operations in the cloud still in question. But data in the cloud now is pretty much allowed based on kind of this bring your own key and provisioned access model that is now available under CIP 4 and CIP 11, the changes that were just put in January. So we did resolve much of the, restrictions around that. So you can put BCSI, or the sensitive information about your CIP systems, in the cloud now in a way that would be compliant. That was the goal, and that seems to be the what happened. As far as operations in the cloud, still in question. And the virtualization standards go a long way. The ones that just got adopted this week. The way it works is the utilities write the regulation, the proposed regulation, and then submit it to the entire utility base. And then they vote on it and determine if they like it or not. This one has gone, this is its 6th round to go through the vote process and get shot down and get voted shot down. So it finally passed this time, and the numbers look pretty good. They're all above 80%. And sometimes they were like in the 20%, just slammed terribly. So it didn't take a stomping. It did a really good job and passed the gauntlet this time. So now that it's been approved it's written by the industry, now it's approved by the industry, it goes to NERC's board for approval, which is traditionally a rubber stamp. The board's not going to go against the industry that wrote it and voted for it. And then it goes to FERC for approval. So there's a long path in front of this still from the regulatory process. And there's an implementation window after FERC approves it. But even given that, the stuff in the virtualization standards get us closer. Is it perfect to do operations in the cloud? Not yet. There's still some sticky issues, even with the latest draft. But given that, I think we're at least to the place where we can say operations in the cloud without someone freaking out, and running out of the room with their hair on fire, or getting into a shouting match about how that's never ever going to happen. Not on my watch, with my cold dead fingers. So we're closer and closer and closer.
Yeah.
Is it perfect? And are we there yet? I don't want to say we're there. I want to say we're approaching the ability to get there.
Okay. Okay, well, that's good to
Yeah.
hear. And I think electric is always one of the toughest sectors, just given the speed that everything happens, and much different than
Yeah.
water or even
Yeah.
manufacturing because of the uptime requirements and the speed and such. But I can see, and I've talked to a number of asset owners this way that kind of have this, some of them have this cloud, oh no, never. And I'm like, wouldn't it be nice to have a backup or a tertiary control center in the cloud? So if something doesn't happen, if you lose this thing, boy, you can spin that up. And if it goes down, and if all the power's out in the West Coast, you can spin one up in Atlanta, and
Hmm.
boom, you're running. I think there's some huge uptime reliability benefits, even if
Yeah.
you just use it as a backup in case your on-prem stops working. So I really am looking forward to seeing that, but I can understand the difficulty from a regulatory standpoint of figuring out how you deal with that.
Yeah, and even dealing with things like is the entire cloud operation solely in U.S. soil? Because at
Yeah.
that point, remember, if it leaves U.S. soil, the regulations have no control over it. So, like, if you
Mm,
try to operate a registered U.S. power company from another country, then FERC has no jurisdiction on that. So they just don't allow it. Period. They just won't let you
yeah,
register.
yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense.
And if, even for smaller organizations, I do see, I've got a couple of small clients that right now they are literally running on protection. That's it. They've got no SCADA. They've got no, no real visibility. They're just running on protection, no digital fault recorders. They know when there's an outage because someone calls them and says, I'm out of power.
Yeah,
That's pretty much
yeah.
it. No outage management platform, because all of those things take expensive IT resources and expensive IT assets, like
Hmm.
humans and assets. So they're all, the smaller ones are looking at ways to do this in the cloud because they can basically buy an instance with a bunch of their buddies and get this at a fraction of the cost. I mean, way,
Hmm.
way, way cheaper than buying a bunch of servers and workstations and building a data center and hiring the people to manage them. And a lot of these are in rural areas where there's not a lot of IT resources available. So for
Hmm.
them to have like a patched, managed, well-maintained, humming environment that may occasionally go down when GCP or Amazon has a hiccup, they're okay with that. They're like, before that, I was running purely on protection. I didn't even have visibility. So they'll pay that small fraction to get the visibility and SCADA and ONS and everything else out of their environment at literally pennies on the dollar in comparison. So their ability to be overall long-term more reliable shoots through the roof in comparison.
Well, now I'm afraid to read another quote from you since I did such a bad job reading last time. But
Oh no.
I really found this to be instructive and interesting. I'd like to have you elaborate on it. You said you can have the crappiest standard in the hands of a really good regulator, and it makes all the difference. Or you can have the world's best possible written standard in the hands of a crappy regulator, and all bets are off. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing some of that was your experience with WECC, just actually being the regulator. But how does that influence the way we should be doing regulation? Are we worrying too much about the front side, the documents, and not enough about the regulators who are doing the work? Because I have a little bit of experience with this in some of the financial regulations, like Graham Leach Bliley and some of the
Mhm.
others that had almost no instruction. They were
Yeah.
terrible regulations. They were just broad goals that somehow the regulatory committee had to or community had to say, this is how we're going to audit and tell whether you're compliant with this broad thing. So it really resonated with me, but I'm just wondering how much effort we spend on the regulatory side.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the regulation. But when regulating tech in particular, it moves so fast. So the pace of innovation, the pace of adversary behavior change, all of these things are so fast. Writing regulation in that space is insanely challenging. Writing a future-proof regulation that isn't useless by the time you get done banging the gavel that makes it effective is it's almost impossible. So that's part of the reason. The other part is you've got a situation where the regulators that are doing the auditing, for example, there's no there's no requirements on their level of expertise or knowledge or capabilities. So you've got to have a license to be a barber to drive a car, but there's no specifications whatsoever for who is auditing your company against NERC CIP, which is effectively keeping the power on. and safe for X number of people in the footprint of that specific utility or the entire region for that matter. So I think we've got a lot of challenges in that if you write a very specific regulation, it's actually easier to comply to because you can go to the letter of the law.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of prescription, and you also know how to game it to get around those very prescriptive methods by simply tweaking a few things to get around it. So they don't like writing prescriptive regulations. There's a balance in there of just enough prescription so that it's difficult to game. You don't have unintended consequences. One of the examples is in the CIP standards is a 1,500 megawatt threshold for generation. And a lot of plants will just basically come in and separate the control systems so that it's two systems that are under 1,500 to separate the plant. Or you've got a lot of 74 megawatt threshold wind parks and solar parks because the registration threshold is 75. Okay, some things are going to be on the boundary anyway. But I think the fact that when you write the regulation, if you write it vague and future-proof, you put almost all the weight on the auditors or the enforcement mechanism, as it's called. And there's a difficult balance there because you can write it prescriptive and immediately have it be useless because everything is innovating so fast, or you can write it so vague that says these are our general goals, and the auditors have to be educated enough and have to understand the systems enough to know when you're getting it right. Then you're putting all the trust on that audit side. Somewhere in there, there's a balance. There really isn't anything perfect. It's going to take us some attempts to figure this out. But right now, as it currently stands, there's no real credential or license or skill set necessary to audit the CIP standards from a regulatory perspective. It could be anyone.
Well, and I think if you look at the direction that the U.S. appears to be going, it appears to be going more specific requirements, very detailed. Here's the list of the 40 controls that or like the 38 critical controls that you need to do. And then you audit those as opposed to a risk-based approach that's a little bit broader. Maybe just one last regulatory question. I was chuckling when I saw AWWA, the American Water and Wastewater Association, I think. Anyways, the big water industry organization was suggesting that they should follow the NERC CIP model, that they should have like EPA be FERC and come up with an ERO. And they actually wrote this in a report. They did a study. They wrote this in a report and submitted it to Congress. You see you shaking your head that you don't think that's the right approach. You shouldn't have that middle person in between. You don't think?
I don't think it's necessary anymore. I do think when, for example, the CIP standards came out, the only way we were going to get a regulation is if we let the industry write it. And kind of live with what they wrote and put some buffers between the regulator and the industry and kind of have some space to breathe, because it was the first industry to get regulated like that. I think at this point, we're 20 years past that. I mean, that's a long time. Even in utility time, that's a long time. Yeah. And that's the depreciation of some of our assets. We've recovered our investment even on some of these assets in that window. So I think given what we know now, it's probably best to pick something uniform. And this is some of the things I like about like the cybersecurity strategy, for example. It actually talks about the elephant in the room of software liability. I mean, we've been dancing around this tree for forever, right? And even in the EULA, it says not for use in critical applications, but we still use it in critical applications and have some expectation otherwise. But the software liability component, but more importantly, the alignment of some minimum set of expectations across infrastructures, which is what the CPGs were originally started for. They've taken an interesting path. They're not perfect by any stretch, but the concept was, what are the common measurements between the control systems of electric, gas, water, wastewater, and chemical? Okay, I mean, in a very general sense and in a very oversimplified sense, SCADA is SCADA. It's flow control. Boxes on a belt, water on a pipe, power on the line. It's all flow control. And a lot of the control systems are the same vendors, same tech, a lot of the processes look really similar, just different things in the process in terms of what product comes out. When boards, when insurance companies, when government agencies, state, federal, whatever, ask, where do we stand in our most critical infrastructures? The answers that come back are like, cucumber, pineapple, watermelon. and they have to like translate what they're saying because they measure all things differently. We need to pick some simple common measurement that we're at least all doing the things we should be doing. So I'm actually a fan of the things that came out of the National Security Memorandum and the National Cybersecurity Strategy. So I do think those things would be tremendously useful, not just from can the government understand where we stand, but it's do we need funding? Do we need regulation? Insurance can use the same information. Boards want to know the same thing. If I'm on a board and I've got a gas and a water company, or a gas and electric company, or an electric and water, and I got two different metrics coming back at me, it's confusing. I mean, it's already confusing enough, but add that to it, it makes it even worse.
Well, in the few minutes we have left here, I just wanted to give you a chance if there was something you were passionate about, that like something that sticks in your craw or something that you really want to promote more. I think in the pre-talk we were talking about AI, but that's a real buzzword thing. So if you say
Yeah.
AI, I'm gonna have you say, well, what the heck do you mean? But is there something that kind of raises your blood pressure when you think about it, either from being excited or frustrated in the broad OT security and OT cyber risk sense?
Yeah, it is right now. It's AI, unfortunately, because it's so
Oh,
pervasive
that's
and
not
it's so
unfortunate.
everywhere. And
But
it's just such a
what
trash
aspect
can
of it?
term. Well, it's like saying jazz, right? I mean, well, what kind, right? I mean, you like that Kenny G style or like the Miles Davis style? I mean, there's a lot of different things about it that when people say it, all they know is that, it's this new thing and they don't really understand it. So, what I would ask everyone is to take an extra 5 minutes, take a breath, slow down, understand the kind of AI that we're talking about or that you think you need. Um, is it going to like transform literally everything? Yeah, no question. Is it going to do it the way you think? Absolutely not. It's going to do it in ways you never thought of. It's going to do it in some ways that were, backward, painful. There are going to be some massive data breaches and spills. There are going to be some very embarrassing things that come along the way. But I think part of that is on us because we really didn't try to take a few extra minutes to understand it. It's very cool. It's a buzzword, but it's also an enormous amount of hype because I mean it's the gonna I mean I expect when I go to RSA this year, every single booth. I'm going to count the number of booths that don't have the words AI or something similar along the lines, just to see what the kind of include versus exclude is. But we've been using AI, basically machine learning and algorithms in control systems since control systems. I mean, this is nothing new in our space, right? This
Yeah.
is not a new thing. What is new is the fact that we've got some generative AI capabilities, and we now have ways to aggregate multiple AIs using pre-processing and basically AI for AI. So that becomes a game changer in a lot of different ways. So I do expect that it's going to make it a lot easier to do bad things, but at the same time, it's going to make it a lot easier to do good things. I mean, just like anything else, the spoon doesn't make you go off your diet. A tool is a tool is a tool. I really just see this as we used to build houses with hand tools. We used to build them out of straw. Now we build them with power tools and we're now 3D printing them. So it just makes things faster. That's all it does. It speeds things up. We haven't changed the laws of computing. We haven't changed human behavior. Just take a breath, try to understand it a little more, go read some on it. There's some really good simplified primers if it scares you. But just take a breath, settle down. Yeah, it's going to change a lot of things, but we can do this in a much more smart and controlled way versus just letting it run roughshod over us because it was super cool or scary.
Yeah. And I would say that almost anything you're doing, you should ask the question, will can I do this better, faster, cheaper with some sort of AI? And I will tell you, I've even looked at doing show notes for the
Mhm.
unsolicited response show using AI.
Yeah,
Um, Certainly, thumbnail images using AI, things of that nature. Uh,
yeah,
so, and in the content creation area, there's certainly a look at it, and sometimes it works. Like I haven't still found any show note generation that I'm satisfied with. I was just trying
yeah,
some last week, and I wasn't quite satisfied with it. It more is travel log than insightful summary so far. But I'm guessing that if I look around more, I'll find it. So I can see that's important. Do you see Ampyx
Mhm.
doing AI security consulting?
Yeah, I already am. I'm building one right
Already
now.
are.
I'm building basically like a Clippy for compliance.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah,
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 I've seen some that makes perfect sense to me too, because I've seen some pretty impressive things about like bringing in documents and bringing in drawings and sorts
yeah,
of things, that can
yeah,
tie everything together. There was even one presentation at S4 that was talking about bringing in network diagrams and using those to augment asset inventories and things of that nature. So there's a plenty
yeah,
of cool stuff out there. Well,
yeah,
Patrick, you're very prolific. The site is still it's what site? We have patrickmiller.com, but where would they
yeah.
read your blog, for example?
Yeah, PatrickCMiller.com is my personal site. And then the company site is Ampyx, Ampyx Cyber.com. And the company blog is there. And I do a lot more blogging. I don't blog on my personal site, I blog on the company site. So all the things that we're doing there from the company and
And
our
you've got a
releases and
podcast now,
insights.
right? You got a
Yeah, I run the
podcast?
Critical Assets podcast. When I get time and there's something interesting that we like, if I'm having a conversation with some peers and we start ranting, I'm like, oh, okay, we should just turn this into a podcast, and we end up something happens like that. So it's hit or miss in terms of timing, but it's always fun with some interesting people.
And frequent speaker at events, frequent attendee at events, and also, I guess,
Mhm.
just as a last thing, if someone wants to follow you or reach out to you, where's the best place? Are you more active on X, on LinkedIn? Where's the best place to find you?
Probably LinkedIn and Mastodon, but I'm Patrick C. Miller on all the platforms. I have an account on all of them. So you can find me pretty much anywhere as Patrick C. Miller.
Okay, great. Well, Patrick, thank you for being on the show, and I look forward to reading your blogs and learning more about what's going on in Europe.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dale. Appreciate it.